Hey guys, welcome back to Team Death Slinger. My name is Peter, and today I'm going to do what we did for Ukomon last week, but for Shine Greymon Ruin Mode. We're going to look at this card, we're going to look at some of the data, and we're going to try and give you the tools to make an informed opinion on if you think this card is a problem or not. So getting right into it, we are going to look at our overall usage over time. We're looking at our quantity of cards played across competitive and casual. And you can see it's only really recently that this card has seen a really crazy quantity of card played. But that's not super meaningful because this is a card that you're going to play at one or two copies. If we look at the competitive shape of the graph, it's pretty much the same as casual, so we don't see any discrepancy between casual and competitive play. If people are running this card, they're running the card. If it fits in the deck, they are playing it. We can see the overall quantity is lower, but again, that's just because this is the casual data set and not, or sorry, this is the competitive. It does not have the casual data on top. So more meaningful will probably be our deck representation by format. If we look at the competitive deck representation by format, we can see this card actually isn't represented in that many decks prior to BT15, and then in BT15 we spiked all the way up to over 100 decks that this card was in. And it stayed pretty high. At BT16, it dipped a little bit, but stays high up to EX6, and then stays relatively stable around 50-ish. BT18-19 we want to ignore because that is a relatively new data set, and this has not been updated since the last time I made a video with it. So we see a relatively high deck representation by format for this card. And then when we look at the percentage of decks that actually see this card played in competitive, we see the EX5 mark. We start to hover around 25% competitive representation, and we peak up over by 50% in EX6, and now we're kind of normalized around the 30% mark, remarkably similar to BT16 Ukomon, and I want to be fair and say if we're considering BT16 Ukomon to be a generic card that you feel one way or the other about, this card has the same representation, so that should probably influence your opinion on if this card is too generic or not. In the same capacity, this card is seeing just as much play in just as many decks as BT16 Ukomon. So we're going to follow the train of thought whichever way you fell on the BT16 Ukomon matter. And then we have a new graph here suggested by DigiPanda, average copies per deck run in competitive play. We can see that on average, people are running probably closer to the 1 copy mark than the 2 copy mark. What this graph is generated by is it takes the total representation of a card, so the amount of copies that were run of the card across the formats that it's been played in, and then it's going to divide them by the number of cards played in every format that it has come out since its release. So on average, people are running 1 copy of this card. So based on that, we could see that if you think this card is a problem, not to say that it is or is not, but if you thought this was a problem, we can see that restricting it to 1 probably isn't an effective means of dealing with the card. So now we can look at our data statistics. So we can see the average copies run in regionals, casual, and aggregate hovers around 1.2. So if this was above the 1.5 mark, we would assume that more people are running 2 copies than 1 copy. But because this is below 1.5, we're going to assume most people run 1 copy of this card. So again, limiting it to 1 probably isn't going to address the issue if you think this card is an issue. Then we have a new stat that we're calling average representation percentage at regionals, casual, and aggregate. And this takes the number of representation that this has and divides it by the number of decks in the format to give you the representation of this card across the formats it's existed in, rather than our overall representation, which is all decks that have been played in the respective format. So you'll see that it should be higher than your overall percentage. So in regionals, since this card has come out, it has been in 31% of decks, which is really high. We thought that Ukomon's overall competitive representation, being at 16%, was high. This card has 25%. So based on its representation in decks as a whole, since it's come out, this card has seen more play than BT16 Ukomon, which, regardless of which way you feel about it, whether this card needs a ban or not, this card does see more play than Ukomon, which is kind of crazy. I thought Ukomon had a really high play rate. Shine Greymon also seems to have an even higher play rate, so a little bit crazy there. Now, to contextualize this data, we can look at some other cards that perhaps have a similar function as Ruin Mode. And to do that, I want to look at top-end cards that other people could be playing, specifically level 7s that might also be considered overbearing, strong, generic, things like that. So I think the best example of this would be the Death X Mon. Let's see. Death X Mon. It's going to take a second. All right, so we have Death X Mon. We can see overall quantity played here also spikes around the BT15 mark, and then our deck representation sees really high representation in 15, 16, EX6, and then it actually tapers off really dramatically, much more dramatically than Ruin Mode. And I think the reason for that is probably because Death Mon is a really format-dependent card. If there are decks that go wideboard, Death Mon is better. Your competitive representation as a percentage, the peak was around 50% in BT16, but we actually hover pretty ordinarily around 30 to 40% for some of these graphs, and then more densely populated is between 30 and 20% is what it looks like. So we could probably call that somewhere around an average of 25 to 30% competitive representation. I don't want to call that similar to Ruin Mode or Ukomon. It is very much more up and down than the other two cards. And we can see the average copies per deck for this card actually seems to trend much more towards 2 than 1. We have quite a few formats where you wanted 2 copies of Death Mon. And based on our statistics, we can see this card actually has a much lower representation than Shine Greymon Ruin Mode. So our regionals average representation is 23%, a whole 8. We'll call it 7 points because Ruin Mode is about 31%. So we're 7 points shy of the Ruin Mode representation, and overall we're only 2 points shy of the representation of Ruin Mode. This card has been out for longer, so it makes sense for that percentage to be higher. But the recent representation number, I feel like for this card could potentially be inflated too, because we have seen a rise in Ukomon's popularity. So if Ukomon's popular, wideboard strategies are probably popular, and if wideboard strategies are popular, Death Mon is going to be cheaper to play and be more effective. So what's another level 7 that we could look at to try and contextualize? This is a generic card, much like Shine Greymon Ruin Mode, and it performs a function that is kind of dependent on board state. I don't think Ruin Mode is as dependent, but you know, they're both generic top-end level 7s that do something. So let's look at, how about Mirage Galgamon? Let's actually look up Burst Mode. Don't judge my messy typing. We have Mirage Galgamon Burst Mode, and just for sake of speed, we're going to look just at our average representation percentage in regionals. Is about 12%. So this is a really powerful top-end card that sees play in specific decks. So we can use this to contextualize a powerful top-end with specificity against a generic top-end that gets used to shut things out. And we can see it's about a 10% representation rate, which I think is probably pretty healthy. It only gets run in Mirage. This representation rate is going to be in response to Mirage being good, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that just means this card is good when Mirage is good, and I think that's probably blanket a safe way to categorize what a good top end should be. It should be good in the decks that it is good in. We could also say Quartzmon does the same thing. And Quartzmon, I already looked at this earlier, I know has a much lower representation rate. It's a 5% regionals representation rate and 4% overall competitive. So what does that mean? Quartzmon is a top-end card that is good in specific strategies. It is not generic in any capacity, and it does not directly benefit from specific decks being good. It benefits from a type of strategy being good. In that vein, it is somewhat generic, but it's also kind of more specific than Ruin Mode. We can see that its average representation is much lower. So this card is dependent on specific types of decks being good for it to really shine. And I don't think anyone would argue that Quartzmon is not a powerful card. I think this card is pretty fantastic. But we can see probably a relatively healthy average representation is 5%. And I would wager that for a card to be in a healthy state, we probably want to see around a 5 to 10% average representation for that type of card. So back to Ruin Mode. Overall, what have we figured out about this card? What have we learned about it? Well, it is represented a lot. This card is probably not overplayed, but it's played in a lot of decks. 31% average competitive representation is really high. Do I think this card needs to be hit? I don't know. I think its generic effect is really, really good. You get to recover 1, delete 1, blanket, floodgate for 2 turns, and it sees just an absurd amount of play. I think based on this information, you can probably make a decision one way or another. You are probably being influenced by if you think a floodgate is good for the game or not. And I'm just saying, based on its competitive usage, that this might not be a healthy card. So I want to know what you guys think in the comments down below. Do you think that this is a healthy card, that it should exist in the meta? Does it need a ban? We already know that a restriction won't do anything because average copies played are at 1. So what do you want them to do with this card? Do you think that the usage of this card would drop if they released a wider array of level 7s that are useful? Or do you think we already have a pretty diverse pool of level 7s and that this is just too good of a card? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Have a great day. Thank you to our YouTube members for supporting this channel. It's people like Langlong and Big Z11 who make videos like this possible.